Minnesota, where it is unseasonably warm, and I don't care if it's global climate change, I am loving it. I'll have our regular guests on the VUU introduce themselves, and then we'll get to introducing our guests. Tom Shade, how is it where you are?
We're in Ann Arbor, and we're warm too. Yesterday was like T-shirts and shorts, and everybody was. I went through campus the other day, and people were, springtime at the university, so it seemed really nice. Maybe winter's come and gone. No. But I'm good, and everything is fine here. The weather is good.
Aisha, how you doing?
Hi, it's Aisha in Seattle. It is 8 in the morning here, not 11, and my dogs are listening to the garbage guys go by. So, but the weather is not warm. We do not have unseasonably warm temperatures. It is rainy and cloudy, and that's me. We're good.
Rainy, cloudy, and the dogs are barking. Yeah, another morning in paradise. Bob LaValle, you've come
We'll see how long it takes for my dogs to bark. I'm calling in from Baltimore. I'm in a massive road trip, going down to Baltimore, then heading to Chicago for the Meadville Lombard Seminary Board of Trustees meeting, and then heading down to Richmond for the spiritual direction class with Phil One and Sue Cinnamon. So excited for that. But it's wonderful. Baltimore is warm and foggy, and it's one of those great fall mornings, the beautiful colors. It's good to be here.
That's great. Well, we'll get to our two special guests, Elizabeth Nguyen and Heather Concannon, who are with the VUU Community Cooperatives, which we're very excited to talk to them about. But first, Aisha, last week we had so much to talk about. You barely got to talk about the Laredo meeting. You want to say anything else before we should have a whole show on it, but I just want to be sure that we cover some of that.
We should have a whole show on it. It would be great. And actually, I'm glad Elizabeth is on, because one of the things that we have been doing as part of Laredo is having religious professionals of color meet across the spectrum of UUA, congregational life staff, DRE, ministers. So it was really rich to do that. And the group keeps getting bigger every year, which is really quite awesome. So that was, and always meeting with colleagues is great, and talking about, how we're going to continue to collaborate and share resources. And I love how open source Laredo is. So that's always an inspiration.
Right. I'm not quite getting that. I know that there's the annual gathering of all the religious professionals of color. Are you saying that something like that also happened at Laredo?
What we do is, or try to do, between Jessica and I and Elizabeth and whoever's there, we say, hey, religious professionals of color, religious educators of color, let's get together for a meal. So we actually just sat together, and then what started out as lunch, I think it went into about 2 or 3 hours. And it was, I don't even know how many, about a dozen of us, I think, Elizabeth, were there. So it was a subgroup and an opportunity for us to talk about, just different kind of perspectives.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's fabulous. 12 of you were there. I love hearing that. What's the revolution? I always feel like Laredo is the revolution in the UUA. That's the community organizers, from my perspective. Those are the people who bring it home. So what's going on?
Amen. I'm sorry, you had frozen a little, so I think I missed the first part of the question, but I could hear you now. You said we're the community organizers, which I agree.
I just said what's coming around the edge. I feel like Laredo started the racial justice work. I remember back at Meadville in the mid-'80s, Bill Jones did a weekend thing, and that was
right.
Laredo's, in my opinion, often at the forefront. So I'm curious to know what's at the forefront.
I think, from my perspective, and please, Elizabeth and Heather, you're both there, jump in. I think there's intentionality around being mindful about what diversity and inclusion means, and what it means to offer pastoral care and support to youth and young adults of color and people of color. And I think that's now, it's not just a matter of putting up a Black Lives Matter sign, but it's also, what do people understand about that? And just much more intentionality in the conversation. I see it as, how do we change the system so that diversity and inclusion is part of how we do things, and it's not it's not, it doesn't, I mean, the word condescending isn't right, but it's not just oh, let's just do this because it makes us look good, but rather, how are we going to strengthen Unitarian Universalism through understanding what diversity and inclusion means? And so I really want to lift up Elizabeth's just stellar work with reaching out to the community and being super just out there, letting everyone know she's a resource for religious educators and youth and young adults of color. So I think that's where I see the people are now paying attention in a different way. Jump in, Elizabeth. What do you think?
Back at you. Yeah, I mean, I think another piece is that religious educators are often the ones who are in a position to have conversations about race as early as they need to be happening. And we all know that we're stuck in a horrible, violent, white supremacist system that we didn't create. And I think it can be really challenging as adults to try to figure out how do we decolonize our minds at this stage. And it's really religious educators who are working with families to figure out how can we raise children in liberatory ways. So that's where I get super excited, besides the fact that religious educators are brilliant and awesome to learn from.
I'm thinking I should introduce Elizabeth and Heather in their broader roles, because I realized I introduced you in a very narrow way, one of the things that you do. But while they are both co-founders and current board members of the UU community cooperatives, we also have Heather is the Assistant Minister of Youth and Families at the UU Area Church in Sherborn, Massachusetts. Both of these folks are ministers, reverends, and Elizabeth is the Leadership Development Associate for Youth and Young Adults of Color at the UUA. So important to know, as in many things, that we're with complex, multidimensional people who are doing many things in our movement. So just to introduce them in both of those ways. So that said, I'd love to hear more.
Thanks,
Heather,
Mike.
you were there as well? Uh-oh. Am I breaking up?
No, you're good, Meg.
Yeah, you're good.
All right.
Yeah.
You were there as well?
Yep, we were there.
Well, that's really cool. Well, then we really can have quite a discussion about the Loretta Conference. So do you feel like the average congregation is getting this? I mean, I feel like, you know, I am a white mom with a kid of color who often was one of those, and it's not, I've been a DRE, I know how hard it is to address everyone's needs, but I always felt like there was more the idea of addressing an actual person's needs than the ability to actually do that. And do you feel like the capacity is there more now?
I think, so I serve a congregation, and I only have, one data point on this, so I don't know about the average congregation. I think that you point to a tricky thing in both religious education and in ministry around kind of having all these resources and needing to sift through them. I think it's incredibly important work, and there's work that's happening, and I think more resources and people who are talking about it that I think are available, and I also know that it's sort of something that we need to be weaving into all parts of our ministry and our religious education. But it's hard to say what the average of congregations are doing.
I think DREs are the backbone of the movement, frankly. Oops. Bad timing for a phone call. And I'm really curious about what you see about how the siloing that occurs in congregations, where there's instead of having a sense that everything we do is faith formation, RE is something that happens in the basement away from everybody else. And I'm wondering, I'm asking all three of y'all, what do you see that are best practices for breaking that down? Or is there new ways of thinking about that, or is that just an age-old problem?
Yeah.
Discuss.
Go for it, Heather.
I think it is an age-old problem, and I also think that there are different ways that congregations handle it. My congregation recently has started a Lifespan Faith Development Council to have religious education, children's religious education, youth programming, and adult religious education, as well as fellowship, all at the same table. we've already sort of started seeing that create kind of that spontaneous or organic cross-generational connections where adult programs knows what's happening in RE and is able to say, oh, well, we could help out with this, or we could, do whatever. We also moved our youth programming away from Sunday evening to Sunday morning, and even just having everybody in the building at the same time has seemed to shift some of those dynamics of not knowing who each other is.
You think that the theme-based ministry helps with that? Aisha mentioned that last week.
Are you asking Heather, or do you want me to jump in?
Take it. Anybody who's...
Well, I think a theme-based ministry could help with that. I think, Heather, I also wanted to say that we also moved our youth group from Sunday evening to Sunday morning this year, actually. I think the siloing, what's interesting to me is how much is minister dependent. And when you have innovative, creative, forward-thinking ministers of any age, like everyone on this panel, because I don't think chronological age really is the factor here, I think then it works great. What I'd like to see really is more of a systemic embracing of shared ministry, really, because the resistance I see is from those who have one view of what being, for example, a parish minister is. And so if a parish minister, owns worship and this is where the kids belong, and that's where the siloing happens, but then when the parish minister says, hey, it's all faith formation, let's do this, then it works great. So to me, it's almost a little bit too person dependent, and wouldn't it be great if we, as our movement, we encouraged and inspired more exactly what Heather said. That's a great model, and we're moving toward that slowly at this congregation. However, if it doesn't, to me, feel like yet there's enough of a global conversation within Unitarian Universalism. The conversation with Loretta has been there since I started 12 years ago. 12 years, and then I understand it started with Sophia Faz and Angus MacLean, that this conversation's been going on, but I don't know what the resistance is, because it's very person dependent within the UUMA. That's my take on it, and I could be completely wrong, but that's my perspective.
Well, I'll tell you. Go ahead, Tom. Well, no, let me just make this point real fast. I'll tell you what happens at seminary, at Meadville at least, is if I'm not exactly sure on the math, but I'm taking at least as many, if not more, history classes than RE classes. And that doesn't feel right. That feels like an imbalance in priorities. But what do I know?
Do MFC guidelines correct that? I haven't followed them closely.
No, because that's, I just about where the parish minister stands in this whole thing, because there's multiple situations there. I've been in ministry in 3-4 different churches, both as a congregant and as an intern and as a minister, and basically you get different situations depending on the age range and the level of age stratification in the church. In the church in Worcester, where I was for a while, which is an old traditional church, there's a very significant portion of the congregation which are elderly folks, not connect. There was a break in the congregational's history, so that the young families and the older folks didn't know each other. And as the minister, you're being evaluated by this constituency in the church around what Sunday morning looks like. Now, in my intern church, there was not that. It was a much newer, younger church down in Texas, and there was a much more unified congregation, and there was a different sense about RE, Sunday morning, all those kinds of things. So a lot of it depends. It's not just the whim of the minister or the crotchety factor of the minister or the old school, affiliation of the minister. There's different constituencies, and you are, as a minister, for many people, entirely judged on Sunday morning, what that Sunday morning worship service looks like. And
my father organized what he called the old geezers when his church.
Yeah, well, there I am. So.
No. I mean the lay people, and they wrote a petition demanding that any minister who came would be in the pulpit 50 weeks of the year.
50 weeks, okay.
And he said, I don't know why ministers hate work. I mean, they want to take a full week off every month. And I was like, on what planet do they? He said, well, they're not preaching. And I said, Dad, Nancy, who was then our minister, probably spent 50 hours with our family when Mom was dying. And he says, that's not work. I said, anyway.
Depends on the family, believe me.
I think one of the gifts, perhaps, of the energy around racial justice right now is that people are realizing that to do the fullest ministry, it has to happen in every place. And so though I'm furious and heartbroken at the number of people dying, which hasn't increased, though maybe our awareness has increased. People of color and Black people in particular have always been being murdered by white supremacy in this country. I do wonder if there is some important lessons around, okay, if we want to have alignment, if the Social Justice Council is doing one thing and the minister is showing up in witness doing another thing and prophetically preaching another thing, and the religious educator is doing racial identity development work with white children and with children of color, and parents are figuring out how they talk about race at home, and a young adult group is doing direct action in the streets, like, I do think there's some powerful testament to theme-based ministry, even though this is maybe a different way that a theme is arising than the more intentional, planful way.
Yeah, it's a lot more compelling, isn't it? Then, yeah.
Go ahead.
That church you just described. I see a lot. I mean, I'm in the Twin Cities. I church around, and I think there's great stuff going on. I haven't been aware in any of the congregations of religious education having a big visible part of it. And so it may be that quiet stuff is happening that I'm not seeing, but it would be great to know what you just described. If that was all visible to anybody who went to church, that would be a really compelling thing. And I mean, there are parents groups, white parents talking, I mean, there are things going on, but I would love to see that unified vision you just laid out, Elizabeth. Well, let's move on to what we actually asked Heather and Elizabeth to come and talk about. So you all have both been, are you both founding members of the Lucy Stone Cooperative? And so you want to start by describing that and then talk about how that grew into the UU community cooperatives, and then we want to celebrate with you your exciting news. So take it away.
Sure. So in 2010, we purchased the Lucy Stone Cooperative, which is a 11-bedroom, 5,000 square foot, 3-story big Victorian house in the Dudley Square neighborhood of Boston. And that is, so it's a cooperative living community where we share resources and food and community. It's an intentional community based on the values and tradition of Unitarian Universalism. And the Lucy Stone Cooperative is owned by the nonprofit Unitarian Universalist Community Cooperatives. So we started the nonprofit concurrently with starting the community, and the nonprofit kind of owns the house, does all the, pays the mortgage, holds the mortgage, does the improvements, and is run by the members, which is part of what makes it cooperative. And UUCC, shorthand for Unitarian Universalist Community Cooperatives, just purchased our second house on October 15th, the Margaret Mosley Cooperative, which will be a 15-bedroom community about less than a mile from our first house, the Lucy Stone Cooperative.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just jump in to say that these houses are coming from a strong yearning among many UUs to know what does it look like to live our faith every day of the week. What does it look like to raise children and grieve and do all the things that life calls us to do, and have the container of a home around that. And acknowledging the power, many of us who are involved grew up UU in UU congregations, so our congregational experience is sort of what has propelled us to explore this. And another piece is we often talk about how we want to serve people who aren't served by the dominant housing market, and that could be around money and the fact that we're able to keep rent more affordable than market rate housing because no individual landlord is making a profit off of the house. But also because there are people, whether they're elders or retirees or single professionals or single parents, who don't feel served by sort of the nuclear family housing model that we have in sort of our dominant culture.
Amen.
Or even people who might feel served but are alienated by the ways that our society breeds disconnection.
Yeah. How'd you get the down payment for that both of those big houses?
That's an awesome question. So we have a mortgage with the Cooperative Fund of New England, which is a fund that loans exclusively to cooperatives. And the rest of the down payment was made up of small loans. We've called them allied loans that are smaller investments between $2,500 and $50,000. And they're shorter term and lower interest than our mortgage. So we do 5-year terms at 3% interest. And we have currently, I think, $340,000 in small investments, these allied lenders, between our two houses. So a significant amount of the money was made up from these loans, and then a small portion of donations. But people can invest their money and get it back, and in the meantime, we use it to finance the cooperatives.
Yeah, and we were really excited about finding a way to be community-based in our financing and a way to, because we know that how we spend our money tells us a lot about our values, and it's really exciting that we're sort of in this larger conversation about divestment and values-based investing that's happening in a lot of places, and the funding of cooperatives, which there's a lot of energy around right now.
Now, I saw on Facebook you have an investment club or something. Is that separate?
That is a separate thing. Boston has an investment club that actually many people who live at Lucy Stone are also involved in, and it's an investment club that invests in cooperatively owned businesses and organizations, and 5 of the people in the investment club live at Lucy Stone. So,
and they did make an investment in
yes.
UCC. But I think to me it speaks to this like really amazing work that UUs are already doing, and I think could do even more deeply about what are our spiritual journeys around money, and for folks who do have the treasure to make investments, how can we not have that be like a thing that happens out here totally separate from our spiritual and religious selves, but another aspect of how we live our values in our world.
One of the things that we realized also is that there's a group of people who will be excited about living in a community cooperative or living in one of our houses, and there's a group of people who are excited about coming over for dinner, and there's another group of people who are excited about it happening and want to be really supportive of it and have resources, but aren't going to move across the country or aren't going to move in with 12 people, but feel like there's a way to live their values with their money and to further the mission of Unitarian Universalism with their investments. That we are able to offer that opportunity, and we see that as a ministry for people to be able to align their values and their investments.
So what's day-to-day life like in a UU cooperative? What's it like to live there? How are you UU when you wake up in the morning?
That is exactly the question we're trying to figure out. We have youth groups come over for dinner and singing. We have a potluck dinner and Sunday night singing every Sunday night, and we turn the dining room into a little sanctuary for an hour. And we often have youth groups come through, and we ask them that same question of what does it mean to live your values 7 days a week? What does it mean? How do you know you're a Unitarian Universalist when you're not at church? For me, and I think different people who live at the house would answer this differently, for me it has to do with how do we work through conflict? How do we make decisions collectively, when, especially when we feel disappointed or disagreement? How do we buy food and cook food in a way that is aligned with our values? How do we engage in the wider systems? I think one of the things that feels important to me about living in community doing this work is that I could live on my own and try to buy more ethical food, or I talk all the time about how I have this grand aspiration to garden, but actually no skill or passion around it. And I because we share chores in our house, I am able to benefit from the homegrown food that other housemates do as part of their shared work for the house. And I allow them to do that because I take on other chores in the house. I might cook dinners or whatever. So there's sort of as a community, we're more able to live more aligned with our values.
And I think, so I'll confess, I do not live at Lucy Stone. I am a proud recipient of generous hospitality, and that I'm there a lot and come to singing whenever I'm in town, and go to a lot of meetings there.
And serves on our board.
And serve on the board. But one of the pieces that I see playing out time and time again is that when you're living with people, it is much harder to walk away. And in our congregations, I think it can be all too easy to walk away when things get hard, or when we're really called into covenant to really live our promises to each other, or inevitably when there are values in tension, and really good values, like the value of affordability of food is often in tension with wanting to buy organic food, which is good for our planet and for our bodies and for the workers growing the food. And instead of saying, well, I guess I'm just not gonna be part of this conversation, or I guess I'm gonna go to a different church next week, there is a level of practice that has to happen, because you're going to see that person when you're pouring your cereal or drinking your coffee, or after a long day at work at like 10 p.m. eating snacks in the kitchen. And so I think there's some real important stuff that is being practiced and not just theologized about or prayed about or preached about.
So do you use modified consensus, or how do you make those difficult decisions?
We do use modified consensus. Yep.
And lots of singing.
What's that?
And lots of singing.
Sorry, Tom, what's that?
Yeah, what's modified consensus?
You mean a lot of things, so I'll let them describe it at Lucy Stone.
Yeah, when the housemates are making decisions, so we've got the housemates, and the housemates have meetings every other week to talk about living together, and the board has meetings to talk, depending on how much our workload is, to talk about the direction of the organization, and both use a modified consensus. But when we're in house meeting, we tend to not move forward until we have consensus and full agreement, though that doesn't always happen. And my experience of it is that it kind of lays out a process of looking at what a shared practice around looking at what one's own individual preferences are, and what one's own principles and values in tension are, and kind of teasing those apart as a group and saying, okay, how much do we value personal preference? How much do we value values-based decisions? And how do we stay at the table and more deeply understand, rather than, and modify our proposals and our thoughts about where we're going together so that it works for different people.
There's a topic it's rare that you find a topic that is as intense as food. So, how do you possibly make that work with 11 folks, week in, week out? That just seems...
For me, it's a practice of living in ambiguity, actually, that I think, are never going to... there's always going to be some questions, or it's never going to be a perfect system. We're never going to live in an ideal world where everyone agrees with 100% everything that we buy. So there's a question of, yeah, we've worked out different things, and a lot of it is actually really relational. I think that's what we've come to, rather than a policy about food, kind of understanding what people's preferences are. They know if I'm going to be home for dinner that night, maybe I don't want a spicy food.
But if you're going to live there, then you have to kind of agree that you're not going to eat a lot of meat, or red meat.
So we do, we purchase food together that's vegetarian. We do allow people to have meat in the house, which for some people has been a deal breaker, and they've not chosen to live at the house.
Yep. And I think it's also amazing to see how that intersects with hospitality, that there's an annual barbecue at Lucy Stone on the anniversary of Lucy Stone's birthday, and there's always been meat at that barbecue just in recognition of the fact that if people come to a barbecue in the summer, a lot of them want a delicious hot dog, including me, or a delicious hamburger, and so there's always also vegetarian things, but that it's I guess the key for me is that it's not about perfection or like rigid allegiance to an ideal, but it's about, like Heather said, living with the ambiguity, which I'm remembering Heather and I and Meg and others are part of a entrepreneurial program of our UUA and UU Ministers Association, and one of the traits of entrepreneurship that we were talking about is the ability to live with ambiguity, that like, who knows whether this is right or wrong, but this is the situation we're in, and how do we love each other in that situation instead of turning our dislike of ambiguity into dislike of each other.
So I'm curious. Oh, go ahead, Aisha.
Well, I wanted to ask about the names, Lucy Stone and Martha Mosley, if you guys can speak to how you chose them for the names of the houses themselves.
They're both badass Unitarian Universalist women. Well, Lucy Stone was a Unitarian, and Margaret Mosley was, I believe, a Unitarian before the merger, and then a Unitarian Universalist.
Who is Margaret Mosley? I don't know who she is.
So Margaret Mosley was a Unitarian in Boston, and then after merger, a Unitarian Universalist, and she's one of those people. I didn't personally know her. She died in the late 90s, I believe.
1987.
But was one of those people who did justice work in every aspect of her life. Wherever she was part of starting either an NAACP chapter, she was Black civil rights person, or an ACLU chapter, and was sort of someone who just supported justice work in her congregations and in every realm that she was in. And she wrote an amazing memoir called Moving Mountains One Stone at a Time. And I can't think of a more apt way to describe her approach to justice work. She also did a lot of peace work with someone help me get the name right, the Women's International League for Peace and Justice. Peace and Freedom, thank you. Especially when she was on the Cape, where she was in the later chapter of her life.
Oh, I wonder how I never heard of her. That's great. I love it when folks like that are lifted up. Tom, did you know her?
No, I didn't know her, but I appreciate when people look to 20th century Unitarian Universalists as historical inspiration, because we're so 19th century oriented that people, that you just don't get this kind of picture of what people who are more closer to our living situation, what they did with their lives and how they built the faith.
And I should just say, she also started a consumer co-op in Boston.
Oh, okay.
So we were like, okay, a UU awesome woman who did racial justice work, feminist work, peace work, and did cooperative stuff, like,
there she is.
What an amazing ancestor to have in living this faith.
Yes.
Totally cool. So what sparked the second house? So Lucy Stone sounds like it's a great adventure in progress. So what made you say, let's do it again?
In June of 2012, we did a strategic planning day with all of our membership and our board and a bunch of stakeholders and community members, and part of this came out of that experience of strategic planning, and realizing that part of our mission was calling us to not only have this one house, but to grow community cooperatives. We also rewrote our mission statement that day, or coming out of that day. The other thing that really, I think, compelled that even behind that was that in the, I think, 6 openings that we had most recently at Lucy Stone, 80 people have applied, really showing us that there's a market for this kind of cooperative, faith-based, intentional living community, and people who were amazing and who would totally benefit from living in community and who would totally bring incredible gifts to community. And we had one space available, right? So, which is at each of those moments, unlike a congregation, I think we have a cap on how many people can live in the house reasonably, and finding ourselves wanting to be able to provide this housing and this kind of community for the people who want it, knowing that there's a market and a need and a real hunger for communities of love and justice and intentionality.
Yeah, and
Will be part? Will they move to be part of the new start, or will that not happen?
Say that again.
Will part of the Lucy Stone Collective move to Margaret Moseley to start that and get the culture going, or will it just be a whole new batch of people over there?
So we've been working with. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
The way that we think of ourselves growing is that UCC has 3 core values of spiritual practice, sustainability, and social change. And we ask that all houses figure out what shared practices they're going to use to live those values. And we realize that Lucy Stone does those practices in a very particular way, and that may not be the best fit for everyone. Like, there are people who want to meditate in mindful silence for an hour every day, maybe with their housemates, and other people who want to be doing affordable housing organizing,
what are the Lucy Stone practices?
So Lucy Stone's spiritual practices include an hour of singing every Sunday evening, and there have also been different practice groups that sort of come together, particularly around meditation. And there's a lot of other things. We've done solidarity suppers where we pass the hat for a partner organization. We also have a practice of depending on our capacity, having people who need a place to stay in the guest room, including partnering with the VUU Urban Ministry around that. But I think just to think about Margaret Moseley for a moment, one of the things that happened is we realized that the core team for the Margaret Moseley House was really energized around this question of raising children in community and parenting in a spiritually grounded, community-centered way. And so that core group of folks, one of whom happens to be a resident at Lucy Stone, those are the folks who will be living in Margaret Moseley and sort of doing the cultural transmission. But I think the thing that's really exciting about expansion is not only do we believe that everyone who yearns for this kind of community should have it, like we're not in the business of creating exclusive cliques, like you have to be special to live in this kind of place. But we also realize that people want to live these values in different ways, and so some people want to live in a house that's really focused on families and children, and other people might want to live in a house that's more contemplative, and we can create as many communities as we need so that people can go deep in their faith.
Is everyone who lives there a UU in the houses?
Nope. People are Quaker and of no faith, and Jewish and Catholic and Christian and not sure, and a chunk of folks are Unitarian Universalist. And that's one of the sort of ongoing adventures we get to live with, is what does it mean to be a community that's grounded in the values and tradition of Unitarian Universalism, that is supported by so many Unitarian Universalist individuals and congregations, and is clear in our UU identity, and also is open to people of many faiths and no faith.
We often say that, like congregations, we don't ask people to say they're Unitarian Universalists when they come to our congregations. We ask them to walk in covenant with one another and with shared values. And I think Lucy Stone and UUCC is much like that. I also sometimes make the analogy, I went to Andover Newton Theological School for seminary, which is a Christian seminary, and I knew going in that it was a Christian institution and that Christianity was embedded in the institutional practices and was this incredibly important source and identity for the institution, and they were also incredibly welcoming to Unitarian Universalists, and there's a diversity of religious identities at Andover Newton.
How much does it cost to live at one of your co-ops, and what are the other expectations or obligations that residents have?
Mm-hmm. So our current rent is at the Lucy Stone Cooperative cooperative is $505 a month. That's about to go up with the new year. We tend to raise rent at a rate lower than inflation because we are able to keep our costs lower than inflation. Partially because we hold our own mortgage. And what are the other expectations?
When you say rent, does that include food and utilities, or is that just, so then does everybody chip in the same amount for food as well? Like what's it cost totally to live there?
Yeah, the houses do their own food practices, so we decide together how warm to keep the house, which internet to get, kind of share the utility costs that housemates and roommates would share, and then decide together which food we're going to buy and how we're going to split that up. So I think food and utilities all together has averaged around $200 a month, which is, I think, yeah.
It's very similar to a family in a lot of ways. Like the monthly rent is set, but then the group can decide a little bit if they want to do something like around sliding scale or an emergency rent fund, which Lucy Stone has both of those. And then also decide, like, yeah, do we want to regularly buy fair trade dark chocolate and enough so that we can each eat a bar a day and have real maple syrup on our waffles every morning? We can do that and pay more, or we can have a bar of chocolate once a week and pay less.
So how close are you to being in a position where you think you could really replicate this or scale it up across the country? Where, I mean, how big do you think, in terms of like, setting up, I could see this being, in many places. I could imagine one here in Ann Arbor. Or certainly in Minneapolis, or Seattle.
Ann Arbor could imagine co-ops there too. The National Co-op Conference just happened in Ann Arbor last week.
Oh, I missed that. So, I mean, where do you see yourself in terms of that growth potential?
I think so. Different people have different opinions on this one because it involves our capacity. But for me, the question is, how do we want to grow? Do we want to be the ones who own houses all across the nation and on half a dozen or a dozen college campuses? Or do we want to...
being UUCC.
Being UUCC. Or do we want to figure out a way to do leadership development and technical assistance and financing that support others to scale, but allow us to focus our resources sort of on teams of people who are planting houses? Or do we want to really focus on the conversation around shifting investments in alignment with our values and sort of champion that work, and in doing so free up capital for projects like this and others? And I think the how is really exciting, and we're still figuring out how do we decide that. We know that this model is financially sustainable and is contributing to some real spiritual flourishing and some economic justice work in terms of investments, living values. But we kind of get to figure out and play with how might we want to grow. And I think another key piece for us has been that we don't believe in growth for growth's sake. I feel like that's a harsh lesson of our current capitalist economic system that we learn again and again. And so we want to keep checking back in and saying, is this about spirit or is this about ego? Is this about the yearning for these communities, or is it about like the fact that growth is exciting? And I think we're doing a really faithful job with that balance, and we want to keep doing that.
That is really exciting. So you recently were one of 6 finalists in the Forbes $1 million Change the World competition, and you won $100,000 from the Forbes Under 30 contest. What was the vision that you put forward that made them give you that gigantic check that we've seen. We'll put a picture on Facebook of you guys holding that gigantic check. But
it was gigantic.
It was. Tell me about that day, and what did you pitch? Which of the visions Elizabeth just laid out? What are you doing there? What are you doing with Forbes?
We laid them all out. We laid them all out for them. So Forbes had this competition that came across our radar for social entrepreneurs under 30, and we sort of looked at it and we were like, I think we should apply. So we did. They were looking for, their framing was disruptive and scalable ideas, and we were like, well, we're scaling now, so I think that might work, and we can be disruptive, so let's be disruptive. So we applied. And they were also looking for faith entrepreneurs, people inspired by their faith as well. So we went down to Philadelphia for the Under 30 Summit in October, and all 6 of the finalists gave a presentation, and they chose one finalist as sort of the grand prize winner, and everyone else all got $100,000. And Elizabeth, do you want to talk a little bit about what we pitched?
Yeah. I mean, I think we felt like, okay, we've already won just by being finalists, and we really felt like it was a win for cooperatives, for Unitarian Universalism, for values-based investing, even more so than a win for UCC or us as individuals. And we felt like the gift was being able to tell our truths and share our story with a community that at least I have never had relationship or access to before, a community that's primarily focused around entrepreneurship and also on starting new for-profit businesses. And we said what we thought is real, which is that no app can heal our hearts or save us from loneliness, that it is communities of real and deep interdependence that are doing that work. And that technology can be a helpful tool. Social media can amplify amazing work and can create community, but that there are ways that we need to be coming together in to share food, to sing together, that to provide housing to each other, that are really necessary. And people were really responsive to that. We had people say, yeah, I'm in software programming and it's amazing and I'm trying to harness it for the good of the world, and it's only going so far.
Now, I don't think of Forbes and disruptive as words that go together. What do they want to disrupt?
That's a great question. My sense is that they have realized that they've carved out this 30 under 30 framework, which I think has really helped them maintain their brand among younger folks. And I think they're responding to the fact that people are really energized around this framing of disruption. But I think it's all relative. I think, a disruptive dating app is maybe not like the thing I'm most excited about disrupting in terms of.
I had the sense while we were there that what we were hoping to disrupt was not necessarily what they were hoping to disrupt, but
I personally would love to disrupt dating, so don't hold back. I do love the idea of you guys going to Forbes and saying, yeah, we want to overturn the capitalist paradigm here. So
which is exactly what we said. And it's a really
who were their judges? Were they people we would recognize, or was it just?
I don't know. One of them went to a UU summer camp, though.
Yeah, they were all folks who had significant roles either in philanthropy or in business.
Well, they use the word disrupt in a very different way than we use. They think Uber disrupts.
Right. But I think, I was amazed at the fact that people were so responsive. And even I guess it was powerful for me to sit at a table with people who I feel like I have very little in common with, like 21-year-old venture capitalists and people private equity people, and realize that we have a lot of common ground in some ways. And I know that we also have venture capitalists and private equity people within Unitarian Universalism who, some of whom have been amazing supporters of our work. So I shouldn't need to relearn that lesson again, but it was still striking that the sort of yearning for ancient practices and spiritual nourishment really is everywhere. And there is some realization that our current economic structures are not going to get us there.
It was also one story that that I kind of think exemplifies the wide diversity of life experiences that were there, was that Elizabeth and I both wore clergy collars on stage and said we were ministers, and when we got off stage and we're sort of talking to people afterwards, one woman came up to us and asked, are you really ministers? And we were like, yep, it's true. And she said, which I was surprised to hear, she's like, I've never seen women ministers before, which I thought was just really, you know, I grew up with women ministers. I grew up in Unitarian Universalism, where more than half of our ministers are women, and was just so, it was a moment where I realized kind of what a small slice of the world I can tend to exist in, and how cross-sector and cross-cultural in some interesting and surprising ways this experience was.
Did you make connections there that you feel like you can build on from having gone to that, or was it kind of like a one-shot deal?
I think time will tell.
We've definitely made some neat connections, and I think for me one of the big gifts of it was the invitation to dream really big and be really ambitious in our thinking, because that's sort of what they asked, like cast a wide vision and tell us what it is. And so that's the piece that I'm excited to continue on the journey with, and to think together about how Unitarian Universalist individuals and institutions who are excited about this work can partner with us, how we can share resources, and how we can grow this model that is financially sustainable and is really spiritually nourishing.
Hey, put CLF in there as a collaborator. I think this is a really, really exciting movement for us spiritually. I mean, it takes home church to a new level, you know. It's not just people meeting. I mean, I think back on, I mean, you know, I owned a house cooperatively back in the 80s with other people, and it's certainly the foundation of my spiritual life, though it was not in any way a UU house. But those practices you talk about are very, very real. And what we didn't do well was leadership training, so that when people started to leave, it fell apart. We did not pass it along well, which I know you are. So I think that's so important. But
well, it's really hard to do well, and we see that with many of our emerging ministries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, go ahead. Talk about.
I would say, I mean, I think it's something that we're also trying to figure out how to do best. I think it continues to be a question for us about how to transmit institutional history and institutional memory, and create practices that are more based on the institutions and policies that other people can enter into than on the individuals.
Would you say you draw more from Fruitlands or from Hopedale in terms of your...
Well, unlike Fruitlands, we have warm clothes, and unlike Hopedale, we have fire insurance. So
that's a total UU insider joke. So
we'll talk about those other earlier collective experiences, and I wonder what kind of like orientation or training, for lack of a better word, do people go through as they come in or before they come to figure out if it's a good fit, or how does the history and the tradition get held up, you know?
Well, when people apply, they do a written application and then an interview, and we ask them to come to an open house to kind of understand the community, get a sense of very surface level kind of what we're about. And it's a good moment for them to realize that if the room is tiny, or if they look at the kitchen and they realize they could never share a kitchen with 13 people, they kind of self-select at that point. And then we do an interview, which is kind of a mutual discernment interview. They get to learn a little bit more about us and ask their questions, and we get to ask questions about, we've really refined that process to ask ourselves what the core criteria is that we're looking for in new housemates. And then when they come, they get a mentor. You know, each house may do it differently, is the other piece of this. So I'm just speaking from Lucy Stone's almost 5 years of practice at this point. 5 years in February we'll have been living in the house together, which is amazing to kind of realize. And so they get a little orientation. We have a housemate handbook, which has kind of all of those policies. And then part of it for me, as somebody who's lived in the house for a long time, is realizing that new people need to be acclimated to the system kind of consistently, and all of our conversation about not leaving sponges in the sinks may need to be repeated kind of on a regular basis, just because the turnover
That is
happens.
so true, those sponges in the sink, man. I'm kidding. There are some universals in life, right? It all comes down to sponges in the sink.
And
so
I think
we have a couple more minutes. I'd love for you to say anything we didn't ask that you were hoping we would, and Elizabeth, whatever you were about to say, too.
I was just going to say, in terms of our spiritual ancestors, I think it's important to lift up that cooperative living in many different forms is ancient, and we inherit a lot of hard-earned wisdom from the cooperative movement in the U.S. and globally, and in addition to from sort of our liberal religious ancestors who were doing these communitarian experiments in the U.S. And so it feels like a miracle in a lot of ways that this is working really well, because it is so challenging, and there are so many communities that have done vibrant ministry and then dissolved, and so it's just really a blessing to be able to be part of this particular moment in this one.
Mm-hmm. And I want to lift up just sort of the gratitude that we hold for people who have supported us and invested in us and offered us advice and wisdom and feedback throughout the last 6 or 7 years as we've been starting up and taking off and now expanding. I think it's the people who have been willing to offer time and support and energy, as well as trust and risk. I think that's an important piece of emerging ministries is how much risk can we tolerate, and how much ambiguity can we tolerate as we're trying new things and exploring new avenues of what it means to live our faith. So I just want to really lift up all of those people who have been there along the way and on the journey with us.
Amen to that. And that makes me just one more really quick question. Where was this born? I'm picturing a young adult conference or something. Am I off? Like who hatched this this idea as it began at the very nucleus?
The story, as I understand it, is that it was born on the front porch of Greg Buckland's college co-op. Greg Buckland and Matt Meyer were our two UU young adults who collaborated and were involved in co-ops in college, and I think saw a compatibility among cooperative living and Unitarian Universalist values. From there, in 2008, 2009, they pulled together a planning team. Elizabeth and I were both on that planning team.
So don't you love that? From a front porch to 2 big houses and
2 front porches now.
Yeah, 2 front porch. Well, exactly, and disrupting Forbes' world and $100,000, and it's really, really exciting and inspiring. Thank you for sharing.
Thank
Anybody
you for having us.
Have a last word to throw in here?
I want to talk to you guys later about starting a UU monastery.
Awesome.
Let's do it. Onward.
Right.
That's an idea that's been around.
Thank you so
for a
much
while.
for having us. It's been great.
Absolutely. It's been really fun. Next week we'll have Bart Frost talking about UU youth programs. And great to spend an hour with you. Hope that you're finding the podcast. Let us know. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Be well.